The encounter. Lila had always loved the tranquility of the park. To her, it was more than just an escape. It was a place of memories. It was where she had spent countless afternoons with her father, Captain Marcus Johnson, enjoying the simple beauty of nature and the comfort of his protective presence. The park, with its sprawling trees and serene lake, had been a constant in her life, a place where she could feel connected to both the world around her and the legacy her father had built. That Saturday afternoon, as the sun cast a warm golden hue over the landscape, Lila felt lighter than she had in a long time. The sounds of children laughing, the distant hum of a family picnic, and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze created a sense of calm that wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. Dressed casually in her favorite jeans and a simple t-shirt, her braids tied back in a loose ponytail, she looked like any other young woman out for a peaceful walk. She had decided, on a whim, to surprise her father, who was working a shift nearby. She knew he'd be busy, but she couldn't resist the idea of seeing his face light up when he saw her, especially when he was so often away serving the community. She smiled as she imagined how he would react, his stoic, composed demeanor melting into a soft grin, his eyes lighting up with pride and love. Lila cherished those moments with him, moments that reminded her just how deeply he cared, even when the weight of his responsibilities often kept him distant. As she walked along one of the quieter trails of the park, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The gravel beneath her shoes crunched softly with every step, a sound she had come to associate with home. The farther she went, the more the bustle of the park faded into the background, leaving only the gentle sounds of nature in their place. But as she approached a small clearing, something felt different. The usual sense of serenity she found in this part of the park was replaced by a faint unease. Her steps faltered slightly as she noticed two figures standing near a bench in the distance. They were dressed in police uniforms, their postures rigid and their faces expressionless. Lila's pulse quickened as she slowed her pace. She didn't recognize them, and their presence felt off. While one officer leaned casually against the bench, the other stood with his arms crossed, scanning the surroundings with a look that could only be described as hostile. Lila hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. She could turn back and take another path, but something in her gut told her not to. This was her park, her sanctuary, and she wasn't about to let unfamiliar faces make her feel unwelcome in a place that had always been safe for her. She swallowed her unease and continued down the trail, determined to remain confident in her space. As she drew closer, the officer's attention seemed to shift toward her. She tried not to look directly at them, but their eyes followed her, and she could feel their gaze like an uncomfortable weight on her shoulders. Lila's heart began to race as the sense of unease grew. She wasn't sure why, but the situation didn't sit right with her. The officer standing with his arms crossed straightened up, his eyes narrowing as he watched her approach. There was something in his gaze that made Lila instinctively tighten her grip on the strap of her bag. She had no reason to be afraid, but something told her this wasn't going to be an ordinary encounter. The air around them seemed to thicken, and the warm afternoon sun didn't seem as comforting anymore. Just as Lila was about to pass by them, the officer who had been standing casually against the bench spoke. His voice was gruff, but his tone was more condescending than commanding. "Where do you think you're going, little girl?" he asked, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. The dismissive way he looked at her made Lila's stomach churn. She stopped, turning to face him. "I'm just passing through," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's a public park." The officer's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with something Lila couldn't place. "Oh, is it now? You sure you belong here?" The second officer, who had been standing silently, took a few steps forward, his gaze fixed on her with a cold intensity. Lila's breath caught in her throat as he seemed to size her up. He was tall, with short cropped hair and a stern expression that seemed out of place for the setting. She had to admit there was something unsettling about both of them, like they didn't belong here, in this peaceful space with their aggressive energy. The first officer took a step closer, his voice lowering into something more threatening. "You don't look like you belong here. You sure you're not lost?" Lila's eyes narrowed, feeling a mix of confusion and frustration rising within her. She had dealt with many things in her life, but being made to feel unwelcome in her own space, especially like this, was new. "I'm not lost," she said, trying to remain composed. "I'm here to see my dad." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly uninterested in her response. "Your dad, huh? And who's he?" "My dad is Captain Marcus Johnson," Lila replied, her voice steady despite the growing tension in the air. For a moment, the officers froze, as if her words had struck a chord. Then the officer standing with his arms crossed spoke again, this time with a venomous edge to his words. "Oh, so you're the daughter of the big shot captain. I guess that makes you a special one, huh?" Lila frowned, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She didn't know where this was going, but it didn't feel good. She had heard about officers who abused their power, but she had never experienced it firsthand. Before she could respond, the officer who had been leaning on the bench stepped forward abruptly, his eyes narrowing with a menacing gleam. "You're going to kiss my hand," he said, his voice low and commanding. Lila blinked in disbelief. "What?" she asked, unable to process what he was demanding. "You heard me," he repeated, his tone dark and twisted. "Kiss my hand, or else I'll make things difficult for you and your father." Lila's heart raced. She had never encountered such blatant disrespect and abuse of power before, and as the officer's eyes gleamed with sadistic satisfaction, something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let this man belittle her, no matter who he thought he was. Without thinking, Lila took a step back, her eyes flashing with defiance. "I'm not kissing your hand. Not now. Not ever." The officer's smile faltered for just a moment, but it quickly returned, this time darker than before. "You don't understand," he warned. "But you will." His eyes shifted to something behind her, her daughter, who had just walked into the clearing, unaware of the tension between them. The officer's gaze darkened even further as he turned his attention to the young girl. "Now you're going to pay for your disrespect," he spat, raising his hand threateningly. "You'll regret this." Lila's heart raced as she quickly stepped in front of her daughter, placing herself between the officer and the girl she loved more than anything in the world. She wasn't about to let anyone threaten her family, especially not in a place like this. The officer's stance shifted, but what happened next would change everything for them. The revelation. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as the officer's hand hovered in the air, his threat directed at her daughter, who stood behind her, wide-eyed and confused. The warmth of the day seemed to evaporate, replaced by a chill in the air that settled in her bones. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable, yet at the same time, an intense surge of protective instinct surged through her, making her feel more powerful than ever before. She positioned herself in front of her daughter, her body instinctively shielding the girl from the officer's threatening gaze. "You're not touching her," Lila said firmly, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. The officer's face twisted into something dark, his lips curling into a cruel smile. He was enjoying this, she could tell. And in that moment, Lila realized that he was testing her, trying to break her spirit, to see if he could intimidate her into submission. But Lila had never been one to back down, especially when it came to protecting her family. "You really think you can stop me?" The officer sneered, taking a step forward, his voice dripped with disdain. Lila stood her ground, her feet planted firmly on the gravel path. "I'm not afraid of you," she said through clenched teeth. "And neither is my daughter." The officer's gaze flickered for a moment, as if he hadn't expected such resistance. But instead of backing off, he smirked and turned his attention to Lila's daughter, who was now gripping her mother's jacket tightly, looking up at the officers with wide, fearful eyes. Lila's pulse quickened as the officer took a deliberate step toward her daughter, his movements slow and predatory, like a predator closing in on its prey. Her protective instinct flared again, and without thinking, she stepped forward, blocking him. "That's far enough," Lila warned, her voice low and dangerous. "If you lay a finger on her, you'll regret it. I promise you that." The officer paused for a moment, taken aback by her fierce stance. He sized her up as if debating whether to test her further. But then something in his demeanor shifted. He lowered his hand slightly, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. It was clear that his power trip wasn't going the way he had imagined. He glanced over at the other officer, who had been silent up until now. The second officer, taller and more imposing, nodded slightly, signaling for the first officer to back off. But the first officer didn't retreat just yet. "No need to get so defensive," he muttered, taking a few steps back. "But don't forget who holds the power here." Lila didn't flinch. "I don't care about your badge," she said, her voice cold. "What I care about is my family. And you better stay away from us." For a few moments, the two officers stood in silence, tension hanging thick in the air. The breeze picked up again, but it did little to cool the heat of the moment. Lila could feel her hands shaking, but she refused to let the officers see her vulnerability. She had to remain strong, for herself, for her daughter, and for the memory of her father, who had taught her how to face fear with courage. The first officer eyed her with narrowed eyes, clearly not accustomed to someone standing up to him like this. But he finally turned and, without another word, began to walk away. The second officer followed silently, casting one last glance over his shoulder at Lila and her daughter. When they were out of sight, Lila exhaled in a rush, her body sagging with relief. She turned to her daughter, whose eyes were still wide with confusion. The young girl's lips trembled as she reached out to hold her mother's hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice small. "What just happened?" Lila knelt down to her daughter's level, her heart aching for the innocence that had been so suddenly shattered. "It's okay, baby," she said softly, brushing a lock of hair from the girl's forehead. "You're safe now." But Lila wasn't sure she was telling the truth. What had just happened felt far from over. She knew something had been triggered, something that went beyond a mere power struggle between her and the officers. There had been something in their eyes, a dangerous glint that she couldn't shake. And it didn't just come from the officer who had threatened her daughter. It was a kind of darkness she hadn't expected in a place she thought she knew so well. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft buzz of her phone, which she had almost forgotten was still in her pocket. She pulled it out, her fingers trembling as she unlocked it to find a text message from her father. "Lila, I need you to meet me at the station. It's important." A cold shiver ran down her spine. Her father never asked for her to meet him at work unless something serious was going on. He had always been careful to shield her from the darker side of his profession, but now it seemed like that side was coming for her, whether she was ready for it or not. Lila stood up, her hand still tightly gripping her daughter's. She didn't want to go to the station. She didn't want to face whatever her father had called her there for. But something in her gut told her she had to. It was time to find out who those officers really were and why they had targeted her and her daughter in the first place. As they walked slowly toward the exit of the park, the weight of the day seemed to press in on her chest. The air, once fresh and full of promise, now felt thick with tension. Lila's thoughts raced. Could it really be true? Was she in danger because of who her father was? Could the officer's behavior really have been so deliberate? The park, once her sanctuary, now felt like a place full of shadows, a place where everything she had believed to be safe was suddenly under threat. And the worst part was that she wasn't sure how deep the corruption ran. But she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to back down. She had faced down fear before. She had survived much worse than a couple of rogue officers trying to intimidate her. Her father had taught her well. And if they thought they could break her spirit, they had another thing coming. Uncovering the truth. The ride to the police station felt longer than it ever had before. The roads that once seemed familiar, winding through the city and past the neighborhoods Lila had known her whole life, now felt foreign, almost menacing. The hum of the car engine was the only sound that filled the silence between her and her daughter, whose wide eyes remained fixed on the window as they passed by. Lila's mind raced. The officers' hostility, their strange demands, and the chilling feeling that had settled in her chest ever since they had crossed paths in the park. It all made her question everything she thought she knew. It had started so innocently, a simple walk to surprise her father, but now she was headed to the very place that should have been a place of refuge, yet now felt like the center of a storm she was only beginning to understand. Her daughter's soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, why did those officers act like that?" Lila swallowed hard, trying to steady herself before answering. She had spent so many years trying to shield her daughter from the harsher realities of the world, especially the complexities of the police force, and the challenges that came with being a black woman in a society that often treated her like she didn't belong. But now, faced with the unrelenting truth of what was unfolding, she knew it was time for her daughter to understand. "I'm not sure, sweetie," Lila said softly, keeping her eyes on the road. "But I'm going to find out. You're safe, and I promise we're going to get through this together." Her daughter didn't respond, but Lila could feel her grip on her hand tighten. She wished she had more answers, but she didn't. All she knew was that something bigger than just an angry officer was happening. That something about this moment felt like a turning point. The question was, what exactly was it pointing toward? As the car neared the police station, Lila's nerves grew. This was her father's domain. He had been a captain here for as long as she could remember. His reputation as a fair and principled man had earned him the respect of the community, and his leadership had been a guiding force for many of the officers. But in the past few years, things had started to change. She had noticed it in subtle ways. The longer hours he had been working, the quieter he had become at home, the unease in his eyes when he spoke of certain colleagues. Lila had assumed it was just stress, the pressures of his job taking their toll. But now, in light of today's events, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more sinister happening behind the scenes. The car rolled to a stop in front of the station. The heavy, concrete building loomed ahead, its stark, imposing structure sending a shiver down her spine. Lila turned to her daughter, forcing a smile to reassure her. "Stay close to me, okay? I need you to be brave just a little longer." Her daughter nodded, though Lila could tell she was still scared. She couldn't blame her. The tension in the air was palpable, and Lila couldn't help but feel it too. She didn't know what to expect once they stepped through those doors, but she knew one thing for certain. Things would never be the same again. As they entered the station, Lila was greeted by the sterile, cold atmosphere of the building. The buzz of radios, the murmurs of officers in the hallways. It all seemed so routine, so ordinary. But now, everything felt different. Every face she passed seemed to hold a secret. Every hallway seemed to whisper with hidden motives. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the world she had trusted, the world her father had built, was crumbling before her eyes. "Lila," a voice called from behind her. She turned to find her father standing at the end of the hallway, his tall frame illuminated by the fluorescent lights above. His uniform, usually crisp and neat, looked slightly disheveled, as if he had been pulled away from something important. His face, usually calm and composed, showed signs of worry, something Lila hadn't seen in him before. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound strong. He walked toward her, his eyes scanning her face before resting on her daughter. His expression softened as he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Are you both okay?" he asked quietly, his voice full of concern. "We're fine," Lila replied, though her voice didn't carry the confidence she wished it did. But something happened in the park. Those officers, they weren't just random. They knew who I was. They were targeting us. Her father's expression shifted instantly. His brow furrowed and his jaw tightened. He glanced quickly at the other officers nearby, as if to make sure they weren't listening, before motioning for her to follow him. "Let's go into my office," he said, his voice low. We need to talk." Lila and her daughter followed him down the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet building. They'd reached his office, and as he opened the door, Lila's father paused, looking back at her with a serious expression. "Lila, I need you to understand something," he said, his voice almost hesitant. "The situation we're in, it's bigger than you think." Lila's heart skipped a beat. She stepped into his office, sitting down across from him as he closed the door behind them. "What do you mean, Dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her father took a deep breath, rubbing his forehead before locking eyes with her. "The officers you encountered today, those two, especially the one who threatened you and your daughter, they're part of something. Something that's been brewing for a while now. I've been trying to keep it from you, but I can't anymore." Lila's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" Her father hesitated before speaking again, his words weighed down with the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "There's a faction of officers here who have been pushing their own agenda. They've been bending the rules, taking things into their own hands, and using their authority to intimidate people, to exert control over certain communities. And the worst part is, I've been trying to stop it, but they've been covering their tracks, and I think they're starting to target us." Lila's stomach twisted. "Target us? But why?" Her father leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around the edge of the desk. "Because of me. Because of what I stand for. Because I've been trying to keep this department honest, trying to weed out the corruption. And now they want to make sure I don't get in their way. And if that means threatening you and your daughter, well, so be it." Lila's head spun. This wasn't the world she had grown up knowing. This wasn't the man she had always admired. Strong, honorable, a protector of the community. Now it seemed like everything was being called into question, and she wasn't sure how deep this rabbit hole went. She turned to her daughter, who had remained quiet, taking in every word her grandfather had said. Lila's heart ached for her. She had never wanted her to be caught up in something so dangerous, so corrupt. But now Lila realized there was no turning back. The threat was real, and her family was at the center of it. The hidden forces. Lila couldn't shake the weight of her father's words as they reverberated in her mind. The room around her seemed to close in, the once familiar walls of her father's office now feeling like a prison. He had spent his life working to uphold justice, yet now, in the very space where he had once taken pride in his duty, she saw a man who was cornered, a man who felt as though his back was against the wall. She had always seen her father as unshakable, the rock that kept their world grounded. But now he seemed vulnerable, the cracks in his armor visible for the first time. Her daughter sat quietly beside her, her small hand clutched tightly in Lila's. The tension in the room hung thick, suffocating. Lila's mind raced, trying to process the information her father had just revealed. A faction of corrupt officers in the department, and they were targeting her family. It all felt too much to grasp, too impossible to believe. Yet, as she looked into her father's eyes, she could see the truth in his gaze. "I didn't want to tell you like this," her father said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I've been trying to shield you both from the reality of what's been happening here. I didn't want you involved in this, Lila. I never wanted you to carry this burden." Lila shook her head, her mind spinning. "Dad, what are we supposed to do now? How do we fight something like this? Something so hidden, so deep in the system." Her father exhaled slowly, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "We have to expose them. We have to go public. But we need to be careful. These officers, they have connections everywhere. They're not just going to let us walk away from this." Lila's chest tightened at the thought of the officers who had threatened her and her daughter earlier that day. The cold, calculated way they had stood in her path, the malicious glee in their eyes when they had tried to intimidate her. It was clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was part of something much bigger, something that reached deep into the very core of the department. "What's the plan, then?" Lila asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "What do we do next?" Her father leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. "First, we need to gather evidence. We need to show that these officers are abusing their power and that they're operating under the radar. I've started compiling a list of names and incidents, but I don't have enough. They've been careful, too careful. But I have a feeling they're getting sloppy, and we need to be ready to move fast when they do." Lila listened intently, her mind shifting gears. She had always admired her father's methodical approach, his ability to think ahead and strategize. But this was different. This wasn't just a matter of solving a case or dealing with a minor corruption scandal. This was about her family's safety. This was about her father's career, his reputation, and everything they had built together being destroyed by a group of rogue officers. "I'll help," Lila said, her voice firm. "I don't know how, but I'll help you bring this to light." Her father looked at her, a mixture of pride and worry in his eyes. "Lila, you don't have to get involved. I don't want you to risk your safety." "I'm already involved," she replied, her tone unwavering. "You're my father. I've been with you every step of the way, and I'm not going to stop now." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening. A young officer stepped inside, looking nervous but determined. It was Officer Miles, a fresh face on the force who had always admired Lila's father and had been one of the few officers who seemed to genuinely respect him. He stood awkwardly by the door, as if unsure whether he should interrupt. "Captain Johnson," he began, his voice shaky. I need to talk to you about something." Lila's father waved him in, his expression darkening. "What is it, Miles?" The officer hesitated before stepping forward, glancing quickly at Lila. He seemed to be struggling with something, whether it was fear or uncertainty. Lila couldn't tell. "I overheard something," Miles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "A conversation between two officers. I think they were part of the group you've been investigating." Lila's pulse quickened. She exchanged a quick glance with her father, who motioned for Miles to continue. "Go on," her father urged. "They were talking about a meeting, something that's supposed to happen tonight. I don't know all the details, but they were planning something big. It sounded like they're ready to move on you, Captain." And Miles paused, his face pale. "And they were going to use you, Lila." Lila felt a chill creep down her spine as she processed his words. "What do you mean, use me?" Miles swallowed hard. "They want to send a message. They know how much you mean to your father, and they're going to make an example of you. I don't know how, but I overheard enough to know that they're planning something dangerous." Lila's father's jaw tightened as he stood up, his body tense with anger. "I knew it. I knew they were going to make a move soon. But this is too much." Lila turned to her father, her heart pounding. "What are we going to do? We can't let them hurt anyone." Her father's eyes darkened, his face set in grim determination. "We won't let them. But we need to move fast. If they're planning something tonight, then we need to be ready. Miles, do you have anything else?" Miles shook his head. "I don't know exactly what they're planning, but I overheard enough to know it's going to be bad. I'll keep listening, though. I can keep feeding you information, but you have to be careful. If they find out I'm helping you, I'm done." Lila's father placed a reassuring hand on Miles's shoulder. "You've done the right thing. And you're not alone in this. We'll protect you too. Don't worry." The room fell silent for a moment as the weight of the situation settled on them all. Lila's mind raced. A plan was coming together, but it was clear that it wouldn't be easy. These officers weren't just going to back down. They would fight to protect their secrets, and Lila had no doubt that they would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Her father's voice broke through the silence. "We need to meet with the right people. Lawyers, journalists, anyone who can help us expose them. The more we get the word out, the harder it will be for them to cover up what they've been doing." Lila nodded, determination hardening in her chest. She couldn't sit back and let this corrupt faction of officers tear her family apart. She had to act. She had to fight back. But as she walked out of her father's office, ready to put their plan into motion. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a battle far bigger than any of them had anticipated. The forces they were up against were more powerful than she had ever imagined, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Lila took a deep breath, knowing that she and her father were about to enter the most dangerous chapter of their lives. But as she glanced at her daughter, who had been so brave through it all, a fierce sense of resolve filled her. They would not let fear control them. They would expose the truth, no matter what it took. The breaking point. The night was approaching, and Lila felt an unsettling quiet in the air. It was a silence that screamed of danger, awaiting calm before the storm. She could feel the weight of the decision she and her father had made, a decision that would change their lives forever. Tonight, they would confront the shadows lurking within the department, the officers who had already made it clear that they were willing to do anything to protect their power. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lila paced the small room her father had turned into his temporary command center. The walls, once filled with family photos and mementos of his career, now felt stark and empty. A few folded papers, a couple of files with confidential documents, and the steady hum of a computer screen were all that filled the space. It was a far cry from the homey, inviting room she had grown up in. Now it was a place where plans for a battle were being drawn, a place where the stakes were far higher than either of them had ever imagined. "Dad," Lila said quietly, her voice betraying the tension in her chest. "Are we sure about this? I mean, we're going up against officers who've been working in the system for years. These people, this is their world." Captain Marcus Johnson, her father, looked up from the pile of papers on the desk. His eyes, usually sharp with authority, now showed the toll the past few days had taken on him. He'd always been the one to keep everything together, the one to fix problems before they even became visible. But now, he too felt the strain of the fight ahead. It was as though the walls that had once stood so firm around them were beginning to crumble. He took a slow breath, his fingers running through his graying hair, and then met her gaze. "I've been part of this world long enough to know how it works, Lila. These officers, the ones we're up against, they've spent years building their little empire. They know every trick in the book, but we have something they don't. We have the truth on our side. And the truth can be the most powerful weapon of all." Lila nodded, trying to muster the same confidence he had. Her father's words gave her strength, but they couldn't erase the doubt that lingered in the pit of her stomach. She knew what was at stake. If they failed, if they didn't expose the corruption tonight, they could lose everything. Their names, their reputation, even their safety. It could all be taken from them in an instant. Her father was right, though. They had the truth. And sometimes that was enough to tear down the strongest walls. The door to the office opened with a soft creak, and Officer Miles stepped inside. He was carrying a small, inconspicuous envelope in his hand. His face, usually calm and composed, now appeared strained. He looked around the room nervously before handing the envelope to Lila's father. "I've got more information," Miles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard them again. They're planning something big tonight. A meeting at the old warehouse down by the docks." Lila's heart skipped a beat. The docks. That was a place no one ever went unless they had to. It was dark, isolated, and perfect for something they wanted to keep hidden. She knew it wasn't a coincidence. They were going to make a statement, and they were going to do it with Lila and her father at the center. Her father opened the envelope, scanning the contents. His face darkened as he read through the details. "This confirms it," he muttered, his voice tight with anger. "They're making their move tonight. If we don't act now, they're going to take this whole department down with them, and we'll be left holding the pieces." Lila felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. They had no more time to waste. The plan was already in motion, but now they needed to move faster. "Let's go," her father said, standing up with a determination that was contagious. "It's time to end this." The drive to the docks was tense. Lila and her father sat in silence, both absorbed in their thoughts. Miles was in a separate car, tracking the movement of the officers who had been sent to meet at the warehouse. The streets that once felt so familiar now seemed foreign, darkened by the shadows of the night, empty except for the occasional car or pedestrian moving about. Lila's mind raced, wondering what awaited them at the warehouse. Would the officers be there, waiting for them? Or was there something more sinister unfolding, something she couldn't yet see? All she could do was trust in her father's instincts and the plan they had carefully constructed over the past few days. As they neared the docks, the air grew colder, the fog from the nearby bay creeping in. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking, dilapidated structure that seemed to have been abandoned for years. Lila's throat tightened as they pulled into the parking lot, the tires crunching on the gravel. Her father parked the car in the shadows, and they both got out, careful not to make any noise. The place was eerily quiet, save for the distant sound of the waves lapping against the shore. Lila felt her nerves begin to settle, replaced by a sense of determination. They were going to expose the truth, and they were going to make sure that no officer, no corrupt faction, would ever be able to manipulate the system again. As they approached the entrance of the warehouse, Lila's father motioned for her to stay close. "We don't know who else is inside. Stick to the plan. Get the evidence. Get out." Lila nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the culmination of everything they had risked. She couldn't back down now, not when they were so close. They crept inside, the heavy wooden door groaning as it opened. The dim light from their flashlights revealed the interior, a cavernous, empty space filled with old crates and rusted machinery. Lila's eyes darted around, scanning for any sign of life. But there was nothing. No officers, no other figures lurking in the shadows. It was like walking into the belly of a beast, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. "Keep your guard up," her father warned, his voice barely a whisper. Suddenly, the faint sound of voices drifted toward them from the far corner of the warehouse. Lila froze, holding her breath as she turned to her father. His face was tense, but his eyes were focused, determined. "I knew it," he muttered. "They're here. Let's move." They edged closer to the source of the voices, staying low to the ground. As they reached the corner, Lila could just make out the figures of several officers standing in a tight circle, speaking in hushed tones. Among them were the two officers who had threatened her earlier that day, the ones who had tried to intimidate her in the park. Her father motioned for her to stay back, and he slowly advanced toward the group, his movements silent but deliberate. Lila's heart was in her throat. This was it. The evidence they needed was within their grasp. But as they got closer, Lila's instincts screamed at her to stop. There was something off about the situation, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. And then, just as her father reached the edge of the circle of officers, a sudden, blinding light flashed from the other side of the warehouse. A voice rang out, loud, commanding. "Freeze. Nobody move." Lila's stomach dropped. They had walked right into a trap. And now, they were surrounded. The final stand. The sharp, sudden command echoed through the cavernous warehouse, freezing Lila in her tracks. Her father, too, stiffened beside her, his gaze snapping around the dimly lit space as if searching for an escape route. The light that had blinded them came from the far side of the room, a harsh, blinding spotlight that illuminated their every move. They were surrounded, and Lila could feel her pulse racing in her chest, the adrenaline surging as the weight of the situation settled in. "Dad," Lila whispered, her voice tight with anxiety. "What do we do?" Her father's eyes flicked toward her, his face set in grim determination. "Stay close. Stay calm." The voices that had been muffled before now grew louder, and Lila's stomach churned as she recognized the figures emerging from the shadows. The two officers from earlier, the ones who had threatened her in the park, were stepping forward, their faces twisted with malice. Behind them, Lila could see other officers she didn't recognize, their faces blank and emotionless as they formed a tight ring around her and her father. The leader of the group, The officer who had first threatened her in the park stepped forward. His face was filled with smug satisfaction, as though he had already won. The flashlight in his hand cut through the darkness, its beam settling on Lila and her father. "So this is how it ends," the officer sneered. "The great Captain Marcus Johnson and his precious daughter. Thought you could take us down, did you? Thought you could expose us. You're in our world now, and there's no way out." Lila's throat tightened, but she stood tall, refusing to let fear control her. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to back down now. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "The truth is our weapon." She believed it, even if everything around her seemed to suggest otherwise. "We're not backing down," Lila said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "You're the ones who will fall. The truth will come out." The officer laughed, the sound hollow and menacing. "The truth? You think anyone will believe you? We've covered our tracks too well. You're just a couple of people who think they can take down a system that's been in place for decades. But you're wrong. You've already lost." As he spoke, Lila could feel her father's hand tightening on her shoulder, his grip firm yet reassuring. His presence, the quiet strength he always exuded, was all she needed to keep herself from faltering. But then something shifted. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, charged with the tension of what was about to unfold. The group of officers, who had been so sure of their dominance just moments ago, now seemed uncertain, their eyes darting around nervously. Lila felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they hadn't accounted for everything. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't as untouchable as they thought. The officer who had been speaking sneered at them one last time before gesturing to the others. "Get them," he ordered coldly. Before anyone could move, a sharp voice rang out from the far corner of the room. "Hold it right there." Lila's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward the source of the voice. Through the shadows stepped another figure, a tall, imposing woman who moved with purpose. Her uniform was pristine, her posture confident, and her eyes, Lila could see it clearly now, were locked onto the corrupt officers with a piercing intensity. The officer who had been threatening them froze. His eyes widened in recognition, and for the first time, there was a flicker of fear in his gaze. "Captain Sandra Hayes," he muttered, as if the name was a curse. Lila's mind raced. She recognized the name. Captain Sandra Hayes was a legend within the department. She had earned her reputation as an officer who didn't play by the rules, someone who had made it her mission to expose corruption within the force. But what was she doing here? How did she know what was going on? The corrupt officers immediately shifted, their nervous energy palpable. "What are you doing here, Hayes?" The officer sneered. "You're not part of this." Sandra Hayes's gaze never wavered. "You're right. I'm not part of this. But you are," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "And I've been watching you. I've been tracking every move you've made." Lila's father stepped forward, his eyes locked on Hayes. "What is this? Why didn't you tell us? Why are you just now stepping in?" Captain Hayes glanced at Lila's father before meeting her gaze. "I couldn't risk it," she said, her voice low. "There's been too much at stake. I've been working from the inside, gathering information. The corruption in this department runs deeper than you could have imagined. And I needed to get the right people in place before making a move. But I've been building a case against them. And tonight, we finish this." Lila couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had known something was off, but to hear the truth spoken so plainly was almost overwhelming. This whole time, there had been another ally, someone who had been working tirelessly behind the scenes to bring these officers down. "You're not alone anymore," Captain Hayes said, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to the group of corrupt officers. "We've been waiting for you to slip up. And now, you have." The tension in the room was unbearable, as though the very air was charged with the weight of the moment. Lila felt her father's presence beside her, his unwavering strength grounding her as the situation unfolded. The officers who had once been so confident were now on the defensive, the power they had once wielded over others slowly slipping away. "You think this is over?" The officer snarled, his voice rising in anger. "You think you've won." Captain Hayes didn't flinch. "It's over for you," she said, her voice cold and final. "Your reign of terror ends tonight." In a sudden flurry of motion, Hayes signaled for backup, and from the shadows emerged several officers who had been part of the team she had assembled. The corrupt officers' faces twisted with panic as they realized they had no escape. They had been trapped. Lila's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the scene unfold. What had seemed like an impossible situation moments before was now turning in their favor. The corrupt officers were outnumbered, their power no longer enough to intimidate anyone in the room. The officer who had led the group of corrupt officers reached for his weapon, his hand shaking with rage. "You're making a big mistake, Hayes. You don't know who you're dealing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Captain Hayes said, her eyes flashing. "And it's over." With swift, precise moves, the backup officers apprehended the corrupt officers, securing them one by one. The tension that had been building in the room slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. Lila and her father stood side by side, their hearts still racing from the intensity of what had just transpired. As the last of the corrupt officers were taken into custody, Lila turned to her father, her eyes wide with disbelief. "We did it," she whispered. Her father nodded, a small but genuine smile breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "We did," he said, his voice filled with pride. "But we couldn't have done it without help." "You were right, Lila. The truth is the strongest weapon we have." Lila's gaze shifted to Captain Hayes, who was watching the scene unfold with a quiet satisfaction. "Thank you," Lila said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you." Captain Hayes gave a small smile, the weight of the situation still pressing on her. "There's no need to thank me. We're in this together, and we still have a lot of work to do. But tonight, we've made sure that justice will prevail." As the officers were led away in cuffs, Lila felt a sense of hope begin to bloom in her chest. This fight wasn't over. There was still much to be done. But in that moment, as she stood beside her father, with the truth finally exposed, she knew that no matter what happened next, they had won something far more important than a battle. They had reclaimed their power, their voices, and their future, and no one could take that away.